The West Texas sunrise painted the desert in shades of copper and gold as Sheriff Daniel Miles carried his belongings into the stone farmhouse he had purchased sight unseen 3 weeks earlier. At 38, Daniel had spent half his life wearing a badge, maintaining order in towns where violence and lawlessness were constant threats. He had been good at the work, respected for his fairness and his ability to de-escalate conflicts before they turned deadly. But 15 years of witnessing humanity's worst impulses had left him tired in ways that sleep could not fix. When the property near Fort Davis came available, a widow selling her late husband's remote homestead, Daniel had seen it as an answer to a question he had been asking himself for months. What came next? He could not imagine continuing as a town sheriff for another 15 years, dealing with drunken brawls and claim disputes and the endless petty conflicts that seemed to define frontier life. But he also could not imagine leaving law enforcement entirely, walking away from work that, despite its toll, felt like purpose. The compromise he had reached was this: he would resign his position as town sheriff and accept appointment as a deputy territorial marshal, a position that required him to cover a large rural territory but allowed him to work independently and choose his cases. The remote farmhouse would be perfect, central enough to reach the settlements in his jurisdiction, isolated enough to provide the peace he craved. Daniel had spent his first evening at the property doing basic inventory and making a list of repairs needed. The house was solidly built of stone quarried from the surrounding hills, with a good roof and sturdy doors. The previous owner had maintained it well until his death, and his widow had kept it secure during the months it sat empty. The barn needed some work, and the well-required testing. But overall, the property was in better condition than Daniel had dared hope, given the low price. He slept that first night on a bedroll on the floor, too tired from travel to set up the simple furniture he had brought. He woke at dawn from habit, years of early patrol schedules having trained his body to rise with the sun regardless of actual need. Daniel walked outside to survey his property in morning light, planning his day's work. That was when he saw them. Footprints in the dust near the barn, clear and fresh, made sometime during the night while Daniel slept in the house. Daniel crouched near the footprints, his years of tracking and investigation experience allowing him to read the story they told. The prints were small, made by someone wearing worn boots, probably a woman or a young person. The stride length suggested someone moving carefully, deliberately avoiding making noise. The prints led from the scrub brush at the property's edge to the barn, circled the building as if checking for observers, and then returned to the desert. But there was a second set of tracks, older but following the same pattern, suggesting this was not the first visit. Someone had been using his property while it sat empty, and that someone had returned last night, perhaps not knowing the house was now occupied. Daniel followed the tracks into the desert, noting that whoever made them was skilled at moving across rough terrain without leaving obvious trail. The tracks disappeared into rocky ground after about 50 yards, showing the person knew how to cover their path. Daniel returned to the barn and examined it carefully. Inside, he found subtle evidence of recent occupation, a corner where someone had clearly been sleeping on a pile of old straw that the previous owner had left behind, a small tin cup hidden behind a beam, and most tellingly, a carefully concealed cache of food wrapped in cloth and tucked into a gap in the stone wall. The food was simple: dried beans, some hard bread, a small piece of dried meat, the kind of supplies someone with very limited resources might accumulate slowly. The cache's careful concealment suggested someone who expected to need this hiding place again, someone who was using the barn as a refuge rather than just passing through. Daniel's law enforcement instincts told him this was likely someone running from something or someone, possibly a wanted criminal using his isolated barn as a hideout. But something about the careful tidiness of the sleeping area, the modest food cache, and the small boot prints suggested a different story. This felt less like a criminal hideout and more like someone desperately trying to survive. Daniel made a decision that went against his usual protocol. Instead of immediately searching for the trespasser to confront them, he would wait and observe. He would make his presence at the property obvious during the day, working on repairs and establishing routines. But at night, he would watch to see if the mysterious visitor returned. If they did, he would learn more before acting. Over the next 3 days, Daniel worked on the property during daylight, fixing the barn door, testing and repairing the well, beginning to clear land for a garden. Each evening, he made a show of securing the house and lighting lamps, establishing a pattern of activity that any observer would note. On the 4th night, Daniel positioned himself in the barn's loft with a clear view of the entrance, settling in to wait. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see movement across the desert landscape. He had learned patience during years of stakeouts and night watches, and he applied that patience now, remaining motionless despite discomfort and the long hours of waiting. Near midnight, he saw movement at the edge of the property. A figure approached from the desert, moving with the same careful deliberation suggested by the footprints. As the person drew closer, Daniel could see more clearly a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, wearing a simple dress that had seen better days and the worn boots that had made the tracks. She carried a small bundle and moved with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect danger. The woman approached the barn cautiously, stopping frequently to listen and observe. She clearly did not know Daniel was watching from above. She entered the barn and moved directly to the corner where she had been sleeping, settling her bundle and beginning to arrange her space for the night, with movements that suggested this was routine rather than first-time occupation. Daniel watched for several minutes, trying to determine the best approach. Confronting her suddenly might cause her to flee into the desert at night, a dangerous choice in terrain where a wrong step could mean injury or worse. But remaining hidden felt deceptive and potentially more frightening when she eventually discovered him. He chose directness over continued concealment. Daniel spoke quietly from the loft, his voice calm and non-threatening, saying he meant no harm, but needed to understand why someone was using his barn. The woman's reaction was immediate and telling. She gasped and scrambled backward, not toward the door to flee, but into the corner as if preparing to defend her small space. Her hands came up in a protective gesture, and Daniel could see genuine terror in her face even from his position in the loft. Daniel kept talking, his voice steady and reassuring, the same tone he used when dealing with frightened witnesses or people in crisis. He told her he was not going to hurt her, that he just wanted to talk, that she could leave if she wanted, but he would like to understand her situation. He climbed down from the loft slowly, making his movements obvious and non-threatening, keeping his hands visible. The woman watched him with wild, frightened eyes, and Daniel could see she was calculating whether to run. He stopped several feet away, giving her space, and asked simply if she was in trouble and if he could help. The woman remained silent for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to speak or flee. Finally, in a voice that shook slightly, she told him her name was Clara Martinez, and that she had been using the barn for 2 weeks, ever since the widow had left and the property stood empty. She had not known anyone had purchased it, had not realized someone had moved in until she saw the lamps in the house. She apologized for trespassing and said she would leave immediately. Daniel told her to wait, that before she left, he wanted to understand her situation. Was she running from the law? Clara shook her head vigorously, saying she had committed no crime. Was she in danger? At this question, Clara hesitated, and Daniel could see her struggling with how much to reveal. Finally, she told him a story that was all too common in frontier territory, where women had few rights and fewer options. Clara explained that she was from a Mexican family that had lived in the region for generations, or long before Texas became American territory. Her father had died 2 years earlier, and her mother had passed 6 months ago, leaving Clara and her younger sister Isabel in the care of their uncle. The uncle, a harsh man who saw his nieces as burdens, had arranged a marriage for Clara to a man 40 years her senior, a widower with a violent reputation who wanted a young wife to care for his household and children from his previous marriage. Clara had tried to refuse, but under the laws and customs that governed her community, women had little say in such matters. The wedding had been set for 3 weeks ago, and Clara had made the desperate decision to run rather than submit to a marriage she knew would destroy her. She had been hiding in the desert, moving between abandoned buildings and doing odd work in remote areas where no one would recognize her and report her location to her uncle. She had been using Daniel's barn because it was isolated and appeared abandoned, providing shelter during the cold desert nights. Daniel asked what had happened to her sister, and Clara's face showed pain as she explained that Isabel, only 16, was still with their uncle. Clara had wanted to take her sister when she fled, but Isabel had been too frightened of the consequences if they were caught. Clara said she was trying to earn enough money to help Isabel escape as well, but work for a young Mexican woman with no references and no male family protection was nearly impossible to find. Daniel listened to Clara's story with growing concern, recognizing the difficult truth that her situation represented. She had broken no laws that he could arrest her for. Running from an arranged marriage was not a crime, though it violated social customs, but her uncle would almost certainly be searching for her. And as her legal guardian, he had the right to demand her return. If Daniel, as a law officer, knew Clara's location, he had a complicated obligation. The law was unclear about whether he must inform her guardian or whether her flight constituted legitimate escape from an intolerable situation. Daniel's instinct was to help her, but doing so could compromise his position as a territorial marshal and could put both of them at risk if her uncle or the intended husband decided to pursue the matter aggressively. He asked Clara directly what she wanted, what outcome she hoped for. Clara said she wanted to reach El Paso, where she had a distant cousin who had offered to take both her and Isabel in if they could get there. But El Paso was over 100 miles away, requiring travel across dangerous territory, and Clara had neither money for stage fare nor the ability to travel safely alone. She had been trying to work her way there slowly, but progress was painfully slow and dangerous. Daniel made a decision that went against protocol, but aligned with his deeper sense of justice. He told Clara she could stay in the barn temporarily while he figured out a safe solution. He said he could not in good conscience send her back to a situation she described as intolerable, but he also needed to be careful about how he helped her to avoid creating legal problems for both of them. Clara's relief was visible but mixed with suspicion. Why would a lawman help someone in her situation? Daniel explained honestly that laws and justice were not always the same thing, that he had spent 15 years enforcing rules and had learned that sometimes the most important judgment was knowing when rules served justice and when they prevented it. Over the following days, a tentative arrangement developed. Clara continued sleeping in the barn, but began helping with work around the property during the day. She was knowledgeable about desert gardening, showing Daniel techniques for growing vegetables with minimal water that her family had used for generations. She was an excellent cook, transforming Daniel's basic supplies into meals far better than anything he could prepare himself. She worked hard, seeming to appreciate the chance to contribute rather than just hide. Daniel made inquiries carefully through his law enforcement contacts, trying to learn more about Clara's uncle and the situation she had fled. Daniel's inquiries revealed that Clara's story was accurate, but the situation was even more complicated than she had described. Her uncle, Rafael Martinez, had indeed arranged the marriage and was actively searching for Clara, claiming she had stolen money from him when she fled, a charge Clara vehemently denied, and which Daniel suspected was fabricated to give legal justification for forcing her return. The intended husband, a rancher named Vicente Garza, was known in the territory for harsh treatment of workers and had buried 2 previous wives under circumstances that local gossip suggested were suspicious, but that had never been officially investigated. Daniel also learned that Clara's younger sister Isabel was being pressured to marry one of Garza's sons, suggesting the uncle saw his nieces primarily as commodities to secure favorable business relationships. The legal situation was murky. As a territorial marshal, Daniel had authority that town sheriffs lacked, including some discretion about which matters to pursue. But he could not simply ignore a guardian's claim about a missing ward, especially when theft charges had been added to complicate the situation. Daniel needed a solution that protected Clara, while not forcing him to choose between his badge and his conscience. The solution came from an unexpected source. Daniel had a friend, Judge Sarah Hendricks, who presided over a circuit court that included this territory. Sarah was one of the few female judges in Texas, appointed through unusual circumstances, and maintaining her position through combination of excellent legal knowledge and political connections that made her difficult to remove, despite objections from men who believed women had no place on the bench. Daniel rode to meet with Judge Hendricks, explaining the situation carefully. Sarah listened and then told Daniel something he had not known. Under recent territorial law changes addressing concerns about forced marriages, young women over 18 could petition for legal emancipation from guardians if they could demonstrate the guardian was acting against their interests or welfare. The law was rarely used and not widely known, but it provided legal path for Clara to escape her uncle's authority. There were complications, of course. Clara would need to appear before the court, which meant coming out of hiding. She would need to prove her uncle was acting against her welfare, which would be difficult without witnesses willing to testify against a prominent Mexican landowner. And most significantly, the process would take time, during which her uncle could potentially force her return if he located her. Sarah made a proposal. She would accelerate the hearing and hold it at an unusual location, at Daniel's remote property, citing the need for discretion in cases involving potential family conflict. The hearing took place 3 weeks after Daniel's discovery of Clara's footprints. Judge Hendricks arrived at the remote farmhouse with her court clerk and a territorial marshal to serve as witness, transforming Daniel's simple home into an improvised courtroom. Clara was terrified but resolute, dressed in a simple but clean dress Daniel had purchased for the occasion. Daniel himself had to testify carefully. He could not lie under oath, but he could frame his testimony in ways that emphasized Clara's situation, rather than specific details that might complicate matters. He testified that Clara had come to his property seeking help, that he had investigated her claims and found them credible, and that as a territorial marshal, he had concerns about forcing a young woman into a marriage with a man known for questionable treatment of previous wives. Judge Hendricks questioned Clara thoroughly about her uncle's guardianship, about the arranged marriage, and about her ability to support herself independently. Clara answered honestly, admitting she had limited resources, but expressing her determination to make her own way rather than accept a marriage she found intolerable. The testimony that most impacted the judge's decision came from an unexpected witness. Father Mendoza, an elderly priest who had served the Mexican communities in the region for 30 years, arrived unannounced at the hearing. He testified that he had been asked to perform the marriage ceremony between Clara and Vicente Garza, that he had spoken privately with Clara beforehand as was his custom, and that she had begged him not to perform the ceremony, telling him she was being forced into marriage against her will. Father Mendoza said he had delayed the ceremony hoping to find alternative solution, and that when Clara disappeared, he had been privately relieved. He testified that in his experience, forced marriages rarely honored God's intention for the sacrament and often resulted in suffering for the women involved. Judge Hendricks ruled in Clara's favor, granting her legal emancipation from her uncle's guardianship. The judge also issued an order preventing Vicente Garza from pursuing any claims against Clara, noting that the alleged theft charges appeared to be pretextual given the timing and circumstances. Most significantly, the judge appointed Daniel as Clara's temporary legal guardian for the sole purpose of helping her reach El Paso safely and ensuring she was established with her relatives there. The ruling was legally sound but practically risky. Rafael Martinez and Vicente Garza would not accept it easily, and there was real possibility they might try to contest the ruling or take direct action. Daniel made arrangements for Clara's travel to El Paso, but complications arose again. Clara's sister Isabel, learning of the court ruling through Father Mendoza, fled her uncle's home and arrived at Daniel's property begging for help. The situation had become even more complicated. Isabel was 16, below the age where emancipation was possible, and her uncle had stronger legal claims to her custody. Daniel and Judge Hendricks consulted by telegram about Isabel's situation. The solution was unconventional. Sarah arranged for emergency temporary custody to be granted to Father Mendoza, arguing that given the religious nature of the marriage dispute and the church's concerns about forced marriages, placing Isabel temporarily with a priest was appropriate while alternative arrangements were found. Father Mendoza, who had been troubled by the Martinez sisters' situation for months, agreed to take responsibility for Isabel until she could be safely placed with relatives. With both sisters now protected by court orders, Daniel prepared to escort them to El Paso. The journey took 5 days, traveling carefully to avoid attention and taking routes that minimized chance of interception. During the travel, Daniel learned more about Clara and Isabel, about their family's long history in the region, about the loss of their parents and the difficult transition to their uncle's authority. By the time they reached El Paso and found Clara's cousin, Daniel had developed genuine respect for both young women's courage and determination. Clara's cousin, Maria, was a widow who supported herself running a small restaurant. She welcomed both girls with tears of relief, saying she had been trying to find a way to bring them to El Paso, but had lacked resources and legal standing to challenge their uncle's guardianship. She promised to care for them and help them build independent lives, and Daniel could see she meant it. Before returning to his desert farmhouse, Daniel made one final stop at the Territorial Marshal's office in El Paso, where he filed formal report about Vicente Garza's treatment of previous wives and requested official investigation. He knew the investigation might go nowhere, that influential ranchers were difficult to hold accountable, but he wanted his concerns on record. When Daniel finally returned to his remote property, the house felt different than when he had first arrived. The barn where he had discovered Clara's footprints was empty now, but it no longer felt abandoned. Daniel found himself thinking about Clara and Isabel, hoping they were adjusting to life in El Paso, wondering if they would indeed find the independence and security they sought. 6 months later, Daniel received a letter from Clara. She wrote that she and Isabel were doing well, that Maria's restaurant was thriving with their help, and that Isabel was attending school. Clara thanked Daniel for helping them escape their uncle's control and said that learning to make their own choices, even difficult ones, had changed how they saw themselves and their futures. The letter included a small package, a carefully embroidered cloth with desert flowers, made by Clara as thanks. Daniel hung the cloth in his kitchen where he saw it daily, a reminder of the most important decision he had made after buying the desert farmhouse. He had found footprints that weren't his, and instead of seeing them as a problem requiring enforcement, he had seen them as evidence of someone who needed help. That choice had forced him to decide whether laws existed to serve justice, or whether justice sometimes required looking beyond simple legal enforcement to deeper moral obligations. As Daniel settled into his new life as a territorial marshal, working independently across remote West Texas, he found he had made the right choice in buying the isolated farmhouse. The solitude he had sought was there when he needed it, but the experience with Clara and Isabel had taught him that even in seeking isolation, moments arrived when connection and compassion mattered more than peace and privacy. The desert farmhouse became known in the region as a place where people in difficult situations could find fair hearing and honest help. Daniel never advertised this reputation, but word spread through communities that lived on the margins of society, that the marshal in the desert house could be trusted to see people rather than just cases, to seek justice rather than just enforcement. Years later, when Daniel was an old man looking back on his life, he would say that his career's most important moment was not any dramatic confrontation or successful arrest, but rather a quiet night in a barn when he chose to listen before acting, to help rather than enforce, and to recognize that sometimes the most important law was the one written on human hearts rather than in legal codes.